Tonight, we follow the trail of a name the Vatican wishes you'd never speak. Azazel. A figure buried in scripture, erased from canon, and exiled into legend. Not a demon, not a god. Something older, something the church never fully defeated. His name appears like a ghost, tied to rituals of blood, guilt, and blame. One goat to God, one to Azazel. But where did that second goat really go? The truth hides in locked archives, in redacted scrolls, in rituals that never stopped. From desert cliffs to cathedral altars, the pattern repeats. Guilt transferred, sin cast out, but never destroyed. The wilderness remembers, and so does he. If you think this is just mythology, think again. Jesuit scholars vanished trying to trace his footsteps. Templar knights were burned for kneeling to his image. And even now, his shadow lingers in prayers spoken by millions who don't know who they're echoing. So before we walk deeper into this forgotten ritual, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive. There is a name hidden in the pages of ancient scripture that almost no priest wants to explain. A name spoken in a whisper, avoided in sermons, and carefully softened in translations. It appears like a shadow, slipping between the lines of holy text, then vanishes the moment you try to follow it. That name is Azazel, and once you see how often he reappears across ancient writings, you begin to wonder why no one ever told you who or what he truly was. It is almost as if someone wanted him forgotten, not because he was unimportant, but because he mattered too much. Azazel is mentioned only a handful of times in the Bible, yet those few moments hold a much heavier weight than most people ever realize. In the book of Leviticus, an entire ritual is built around him, a ritual meant to carry away the sins of a nation. One goat was sacrificed to the Lord, but the second goat, the scapegoat, was sent out alive into the wilderness for Azazel. That strange phrase has puzzled scholars for centuries. Why would the ancient Hebrews send a living offering to someone who was not God? And why did later translators twist the meaning, replacing Azazel with vague phrases like wilderness or complete removal? It is almost like the name made the early church uncomfortable. In the Book of Enoch, a text banned by the Vatican for over 1,000 years, Azazel becomes far more than a mysterious figure in the desert. He is described as a fallen watcher, one of the angels who descended to earth before the great flood. Enoch calls him a teacher of forbidden knowledge, the one who revealed secrets of metalworking, warfare, and ornamentation to humanity. These are not gentle teachings. They are the kind of skills that can change the path of civilization forever. If this is the same Azazel from Leviticus, then the scapegoat ritual becomes even stranger. Why would an entire nation symbolically send its sins to a being blamed for, introducing humanity to violence and corruption? What makes the story even more unsettling is how the name Azazel appears, disappears, and then reappears throughout the ancient world. In some Jewish traditions, he is a demon. In others, he is a fallen angel chained beneath the desert. Some early Christian writers described him as the true force behind certain temptations, while others insisted he was nothing more than a symbol. Yet, no matter the interpretation, one thing remained the same. His presence was always treated as dangerous. His name was spoken carefully, almost reluctantly, as if acknowledging him might draw unwanted attention. So why does the Vatican still refuse to give a clear answer? Why do modern priests avoid the subject entirely? It may be because the story of Azazel opens a door they do not want people to walk through. a door that leads to a time when angels walked the earth openly, a time when humans believed the wilderness was home to ancient beings who accepted offerings, a time when the world was not divided neatly into good and evil, but filled with complex spirits whose intentions were not always clear. Azazel is a reminder of the oldest fear humans ever knew, the fear that there were forces in the world that did not answer to God, forces that humanity once had to bargain with. And maybe that is why his name has been buried in the shadows for so long. Because once you start questioning who Azazel was, you begin to question what else has been hidden behind the walls of silence. Once a year in ancient Israel, something strange happened in the desert. It was called the Day of Atonement, known today as Yom Kippur, and it was one of the most sacred rituals of the Hebrew calendar. But buried within this solemn ceremony was a mystery that most people never fully understood. It involved 2 goats, a priest, and a name that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who dares to ask what it really meant. One goat was chosen to be sacrificed to God. The other was marked for someone else entirely. Not for a man, not for a tribe, but for a being called Azazel. And instead of being killed, this second goat was driven out into the wilderness, alive, carrying the sins of the entire nation on its back. Imagine the scene. The people of Israel gathered outside the temple, watching in silence as the high priest cast lots over the 2 animals. One would be purified with fire and blood. The other would be led far into the desert, into a place no one dared to live, and abandoned there. But not just anywhere. The text says, "It was sent into the wilderness for Azazel." That exact phrase has confused scholars and terrified mystics for thousands of years. Who was Azazel? Why did he receive a living creature burdened with sin? And what did it mean for the people who performed this ritual? Some argue that Azazel was simply a symbol, a representation of chaos or exile. Others believe he was a real entity, an ancient desert spirit or demon who once walked the earth. The fact that the goat was not killed but sent away suggests that the ritual was not about destroying sin but transferring it, as if sin itself was a substance that could be carried and delivered to someone else, to something else. And once the goat vanished into the barren lands, the people believed their sins were gone too, taken away, forgotten, forgiven. But the question lingers. Who was on the other end of that delivery? The wilderness in ancient times was not seen as empty space. It was considered wild, untamed, and dangerous. It was where angels fell, where prophets fled, and where people went to face trials beyond human control. Sending the goat there was not random. It was intentional. It was a spiritual offering sent to a domain outside the reach of God's temple. And if that place belonged to Azazel, then the ritual becomes something even more haunting. A yearly negotiation with a forgotten force. A pact hidden inside a sacred ceremony. Some ancient Jewish texts describe the goat being led to a steep cliff and pushed off to make sure it would never return. Not because they feared the animal, but because they feared what it carried, and more importantly, what might come back with it. In those versions of the story, the ritual becomes an act of containment, a spiritual quarantine designed to keep something ancient and invisible satisfied, silenced, held at bay. So while most modern readers skip over the scapegoat passage in Leviticus, seeing it as a strange old custom, the truth is far more unsettling. This was not just a symbol. It was a ritual with a target, and the target was Azazel. For reasons no one in the modern church wants to explain, ancient priests believed that something in the desert was listening, watching, waiting, and once a year it received a gift. Not a sacrifice to God, but an offering to someone else, a shadow just outside the borders of faith. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, Azazel was not ignored. In fact, he was fiercely debated. Theologians, scribes, and early church fathers wrote about him with both caution and intensity, trying to understand who or what this being truly was. Some believed he was a fallen angel. Others said he was a demon. A few even hinted he was a symbol of sin itself. But regardless of the view, one thing is clear. Azazel was considered important enough to argue about. His name triggered concern and curiosity. And then, suddenly, the argument stopped. Somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries, Azazel began to vanish from official Christian texts. Not just the figure himself, but the very word. In the original Hebrew, the goat was sent to Azazel. But when those passages were translated into Greek, Latin, and later into the languages of Europe, something strange happened. The name was quietly changed. Instead of saying Azazel, many versions now read for the wilderness or for complete removal. The being became a place. The target became a metaphor. And just like that, Azazel was erased not with fire or force, but with the stroke of a pen. This quiet editing wasn't just a small mistake. It was deliberate. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, creating what would become the official Catholic version for over 1,000 years, he replaced Azazel with the phrase capro emissario, meaning emissary goat or scapegoat. The name itself disappeared, and with it, any reference to a specific entity receiving the ritual offering. This shift changed everything. Now it looked like the goat was just being sent away, not being given to someone. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, most Christians had never even heard the name Azazel. He had been buried beneath layers of translations, softened into symbols, and replaced with language that sounded safe and doctrinal. The Church no longer needed to debate his role. They had rewritten the script. And once the official version was printed and spread, the story of Azazel slipped into myth, too blurry to challenge and too vague to question. But if you look at the early commentaries before these edits, a different picture emerges. Church writers like Origen, Tertullian, and even Augustine wrestled with the meaning of the scapegoat. They spoke of dark forces, fallen angels, and the danger of mixing sacred rituals with unknown spirits. They were not confused. They were concerned. And that concern led to a quiet decision. It would be easier, safer, and more controllable if Azazel was simply forgotten. Even the Book of Enoch, which clearly names Azazel and describes his punishment, was removed from the official Bible. The Vatican never banned it outright, they just refused to canonize it. And over time, like Azazel himself, it faded from public view. This is how history can be rewritten without anyone noticing. Not by destroying the story, but by carefully reshaping it. The name Azazel still exists in the oldest texts, but the Church no longer says it aloud. The silence speaks volumes. And perhaps that silence was not meant to protect the people from Azazel, but to protect the story from the truth. Long before the Bible was sealed into its final form, there was a book that told a different version of history. It was called the Book of Enoch. For centuries, it circulated among early Jews and Christians. It was quoted, studied, and even revered. But something in its pages made the Church uneasy. because hidden within its ancient verses was a name that stood out like a warning: Azazel. Not as a metaphor, not as a place, but as a powerful being who corrupted the world. And unlike the Bible, which barely mentions him, the Book of Enoch tells his story in chilling detail. According to Enoch, Azazel was one of the leaders of a group called the Watchers. These were angels sent to earth to observe humanity. But they broke their divine command. They did not just observe, they intervened, they taught, they fell. And Azazel was at the center of it. The text says he taught humans how to make weapons, how to work with metal, how to create jewelry and cosmetics, and how to manipulate the natural world. He introduced the tools of war, vanity, and power, things that gave humans an edge, but also led them into destruction. The book says Azazel did more than teach skills. He taught rebellion, and for that, he was punished. Bound by angels and buried in the desert under sharp stones until the day of judgment. A fate not given to every fallen angel, but one reserved for him alone. In this version of history, Azazel is not just a tempter. He is a trigger, the one who pushed humanity toward forbidden knowledge. And that made him more dangerous than any demon. So why did the Vatican reject the Book of Enoch? The answer is complicated and quiet. The book was never officially banned. It was simply left out when the Bible was finalized in the 4th century. Church leaders claimed it was not inspired. But behind that explanation, there was a deeper fear. The Book of Enoch told a story they could not control. It suggested that divine beings could fall, that angels could disobey, and that some of them were still influencing the world. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria accepted Enoch as scripture. Even the New Testament book of Jude quotes from it directly. But later, councils ignored it. And over time, Enoch disappeared from Western Christianity. In the East, it survived quietly. In Ethiopia, it was preserved in full. But in Europe, the Church let it vanish. And with it, the clearest warnings about Azazel faded from memory. It was not until the 18th century that a copy of Enoch resurfaced in the West. Scholars were stunned. Inside was a version of the ancient world that felt more like a myth than doctrine. But it fit too well with what little we knew. It filled in the blanks, and it made the Vatican's silence even louder. Azazel's name was never meant to be erased. It was meant to be remembered. The Book of Enoch did not just tell his story. It warned us. But for over 1,000 years, that warning was buried. And perhaps that was the point. Because a truth forgotten is easier to deny than one that never goes away. Long after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, long after Azazel was edited out of the Bible, and long after the Church had taken full control of religious rituals across Europe, the scapegoat ceremony refused to die. It changed names, it changed forms, but it never disappeared. Even as Rome rose in power and declared itself the guardian of faith, this one strange ritual kept slipping through the cracks. Not in official cathedrals or Latin prayers, but in the shadows, in villages, in forests, in mountains where no bishop ever visited. The ceremony for transferring sin never truly ended. It just went underground. In parts of medieval Europe, strange festivals began to appear. In some regions of France and Spain, villagers would choose a person or an animal, represent the sins of the town. That person would be paraded through the streets, mocked, sometimes beaten, and finally driven out of the village or symbolically killed. The people believed that by punishing this figure, they were cleansing themselves. They called it the expulsion of evil, or the driving out of the devil. But the structure was always the same. A body carries the blame. The people watch. Then the body is cast out. That is the scapegoat ritual in disguise. In remote parts of the Alps, masked figures wearing horns and animal skins would march through snow-covered towns. Bells rang, fires burned. The creature was chased, captured, and exiled. Locals claimed it was a folk tradition to scare away winter or protect the harvest. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This was not about weather. It was about guilt. A group of people uniting around the idea that their wrongs could be placed onto something else. Something that could be pushed away and forgotten. Even in Christian Europe, the Church had to deal with this persistence. Priests wrote angry letters condemning certain festivals as pagan. Councils passed laws banning public rituals that involved masks, mock sacrifices, or desert processions. But nothing worked. The rituals simply changed costumes. They merged with feast days and saints' festivals. They appeared during Lent or Carnival. And still, the scapegoat returned. One of the most famous examples was in 15th century Germany, where during certain Easter ceremonies, a wooden figure called the Judas goat was hung, burned, or thrown into rivers. On the surface, it was a condemnation of betrayal, but the mechanics were familiar. A figure is chosen, the crowd gathers, the sin is transferred, the body is destroyed, the spirit of the Azazel ritual was still alive. Why did the Church fail to erase it? Maybe because the ritual touched something deeper than doctrine, something ancient, the human desire to be clean, to remove guilt, to place it somewhere else, even if that place was never fully understood, even if that name was never spoken aloud. Azazel had been removed from the Bible, but his presence lingered in the rhythm of human behavior. Every time a town blamed one person for its suffering, every time a crowd needed a target for their fear, the scapegoat returned. Not because people believed in Azazel, but because something in them still acted like he was real. And maybe, in some forgotten way, he still is. Long before the Bible was written, before Moses climbed a mountain or prophets walked the land, the deserts of the ancient Near East were already filled with names, gods, and spirits that whispered through the sand. The people who lived in these lands believed the wilderness was alive, not empty. It was a place of power, of danger, of things unseen. And among those early desert beings were figures that seem strangely familiar. Horned spirits, fallen gods, wild teachers, and exiled beings who waited just beyond the edge of civilization. Some of them bore names that vanished, others left behind echoes. But when scholars began comparing these ancient spirits to the figure of Azazel, they found something disturbing. It looked like Azazel might not have begun in the Bible. He may have come from something older, much older. In Mesopotamia, the land of the first cities, there were stories of beings who descended from the heavens to teach forbidden knowledge. They were not demons in the way we think of them now. They were called apkalo. Some were honored, others were punished. One in particular, a rebellious teacher, was said to have introduced humans to arts they were not supposed to learn. He was cast into the steppe, a wilderness of rock and wind. His name is lost, but his role feels familiar. Further west, in the Canaanite and Amorite traditions, there were deities linked to goats and wild places. One such figure was the god of storms and chaos, known as Baal Zephon. In some stories, he took the form of a horned beast. In others, he ruled from a mountain in the desert. He was both feared and worshipped, and over time his name was twisted into Beelzebub, later known as Beelzebub. The goat-like image, the wild location, the strange duality of teacher and corrupter. These traits line up with the later stories of Azazel. Even older than these was the desert god Pazuzu from Assyrian lore. He was said to ride the wind and bring both plague and protection. With wings, claws, and a fearsome face, Pazuzu was invoked during times of illness. He was not loved, he was feared. And yet, people called upon him, not because he was good, but because he was powerful, a desert spirit that could not be ignored. The resemblance to Azazel is subtle but chilling. Both are connected to dry lands. Both are seen as ancient forces, and both hover between demon and deity. In the Egyptian borderlands, there were tales of Set, the god of chaos and exile. Set was blamed for disorder and darkness, yet was once part of the divine family. He too was pushed into the desert, where he waited, half forgotten. Another fallen power, another outcast god, another reflection of the Azazel pattern. What all these beings have in common is not just their role, but their location. The desert. In ancient times, the desert was not just land. It was another realm, a place where divine rules no longer applied, and that is where Azazel lives. Not just in the Bible, not just in rituals, but in the shared memory of civilizations that predate written history. So if Azazel appears in texts thousands of years old, and if his traits match gods from cultures that never knew the Bible, then maybe the question is not who Azazel was, but who he still is. A shadow too old to name, a teacher too dangerous to remember, a god the world tried to forget. There is a place hidden in the Judean desert where stories go silent and maps refuse to speak. It is not marked by ruins or shrines. It is not visited by tourists or pilgrims. But in the old texts and whispered traditions, this place had a name: Mount Azazel. A lonely hill of rock and wind where something sacred and terrifying once happened every year. It was here, according to legend, that the high priest of Israel would lead a goat burdened with the sins of the nation to the edge of a cliff and cast it into the void, not just to die, but to vanish, to be given over to something ancient that waited below. The ritual was not performed inside the temple. It took place far away, in a region so barren and quiet that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The goat was not led by a priest in gold robes, but by a man chosen for this one task alone. He was not allowed to speak. He was not allowed to turn back. His mission was to guide the goat into the hands of Azazel. Some say the man would fast for days beforehand. Others say he would walk barefoot, afraid of carrying any trace of sin back with him. When he reached the summit, he would tie a red cord around the goat's horns and another piece to a rock. Then, without a word, he would push the animal over the edge. The fall was not gentle. The cliffs of Mount Azazel are sharp and broken, lined with jagged stone. The goat was meant to die on impact. If it survived, the ritual was considered incomplete, because the goal was not exile, it was finality. The sins had to be taken. Azazel had to receive. What makes the legend even stranger is what the people believed happened after. They said that in earlier times, the red cord tied to the rock would mysteriously turn white, a sign that the offering had been accepted, that the sins were truly gone. But years before the temple was destroyed, the cord stopped changing. No one knew why. The ritual continued. The goat was still thrown, but the sign never returned. Some believed Azazel had rejected the offering. Others whispered that something had changed in the world, that the wilderness was no longer empty. Mount Azazel was never named on official Roman maps. It was not included in pilgrim routes. And yet, it remained in memory, passed down through writings and secret teachings. Some say the church knew about the hill and avoided it on purpose. Not because it was unimportant, but because it had once been a door, a place where the divine and the forgotten met in silence. Today, if you search the desert, you can still find rocky cliffs that match the ancient descriptions. Places where no birds sing, where no paths are worn into the earth. The air there feels heavier, as if the land remembers what was once thrown into its arms. Mount Azazel is not just a legend, it is a scar in the earth, a reminder that some rituals are too old to fade, and that some places still echo with the weight of sins that were never truly taken away. To most people today, the wilderness is just empty land, a place of rocks, trees, wind, and silence. But to the ancient world, the wilderness was never empty. It was alive, it was wild, and most of all, it was dangerous. Not because of animals or hunger, but because of what it represented, a place beyond the reach of civilization, beyond the temple, beyond the law. It was the place where things were sent when they could no longer stay. It was where the scapegoat went. It was where demons wandered. It was where the church saw something it could not control. And that made it terrifying. In early biblical stories, the wilderness was always the backdrop for something spiritual and strange. Moses wandered it for 40 years. Jesus was tempted there for 40 days. Prophets fled into it. Angels appeared within it. And people feared dying in it. The desert was not just sand and stone. It was a threshold, a place where the normal rules did not apply, where voices came from burning bushes, where mountains shook, where men encountered something they could not explain. And in that space, the church saw a threat, not because it was false, but because it was too real. The church preferred order, cities with walls, temples with structure, doctrine with rules. But the wilderness had none of those. It held no cathedrals, it followed no calendar, and worst of all, it kept its secrets. It was in the wilderness that the scapegoat was sent. It was in the wilderness that fallen angels came down in the book of Enoch. It was in the wilderness that Azazel waited, and the deeper you went into those stories, the more it looked like the wilderness was not just a physical space. It was a spiritual one, a realm where forbidden knowledge could be found. For early monks and theologians, this created a problem. If the wilderness was where truth could be discovered, then people might start to look there instead of the church. That was dangerous. So the wilderness had to be recast, not as a place of divine encounter, but as a realm of evil, a place where Satan lurked, where witches gathered, where heretics ran to hide. Over time, the church turned the wilderness into a symbol of chaos, a place where you did not go unless God had sent you. And even then, you came back changed. But some never came back. Hermits and mystics who fled into the desert often returned with strange teachings, visions of angels, new ways of praying. Some were welcomed, others were silenced, because the church feared what the wilderness might reveal. If Azazel had been chained there, as Enoch claimed, then what else might still be moving in that silence? The wilderness was too wild to tame, too old to forget. It was the last place on earth where something ancient could still be hiding, not in darkness, but in open space, waiting, watching, And that is why the church feared it. Because it was not empty, it was full. Full of memories the world was told to forget. In the old world, the wilderness was not just a stretch of empty land. It was a boundary between the seen and the unseen, the world of men and the world of spirits. It was where rules were broken, where things that did not belong in the temple found a place to dwell. To the church, the wilderness was more than a backdrop. It was a threat, because for centuries that wild space had been the setting for stories too strange to control. Fallen angels, ancient pacts, rites performed without permission, and knowledge that did not pass through the hands of priests. In the book of Enoch, the wilderness is where the Watchers descended. It is where they took human wives and taught forbidden skills. It is where Azazel was chained beneath sharp stones after revealing secrets that humans were never meant to know. Metalwork, war, magic, the stars. The wilderness was not just a location in that story. It was the stage for rebellion, a place outside of divine order, where beings once called angels became something else, something feared. Later, scriptures followed the same pattern. When Jesus fasted for 40 days, it was not in the city or the temple, it was in the wilderness. And there, Satan came to him. Temptation happened not in the marketplace, but in the silence of the wild. Prophets ran to the desert when they were hunted. John the Baptist preached there wearing animal skins and eating locusts. Even Moses received the law on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. Again and again, the wilderness appeared not as absence, but presence. Something waited in it, something ancient. As the church grew stronger, it needed order. It needed control over where truth came from and who could speak it. But the wilderness refused to be tamed. It had no walls, no altars, and yet it kept drawing people in, hermits, mystics, wanderers. Some returned claiming visions, others never returned at all. The church began to warn against such journeys, not because they led to physical danger, but because they might lead to spiritual discovery outside of doctrine. Folk stories from the Middle Ages tell of desert spirits and wild saints, of voices in the caves, of rituals performed on lonely hills where the wind never stopped moving. Many of these were labelled heresy, not because they were false, but because they came from the wrong place. Not from Rome, not from Scripture, but from the land itself. The wilderness held memories the church could not erase, stories it could not rewrite. So it gave the wilderness a new name: evil, sin, chaos. It said only demons lived there, only madness grew there. But the old stories remain, in whispers, in ruins, in the way the air still changes when you step into a place far from roads and cities. The wilderness was the first temple, and maybe also the last. The church feared the wilderness because it remembered too much. It remembered what came before the altars, before the robes, before the sermons. It remembered the ones who fell, and the ones who still walk. There is a story buried deep in the book of Enoch, a story so strange and powerful that the Vatican has never allowed it into the official Bible. It is the story of the Watchers. Angels sent from heaven not to interfere with earth, but only to observe it. They were not demons. They were not fallen. Not at first. They were holy beings placed on high mountains to watch humanity grow. But they made a decision that changed everything. They looked upon the daughters of men and saw they were beautiful, and one by one they broke their oath. Azazel was not just one of the Watchers, he was their voice, the one who convinced the others to act. According to Enoch, he proposed a pact, a binding agreement. that if they were going to descend and take human wives, they would do it together. So none could blame the others. None could escape. This was not a single act of rebellion. It was a coordinated fall. A mass decision to cross a boundary that had been set by heaven itself. They came down, they took wives, and they had children, the Nephilim, giants, beings of power and destruction. But Azazel went even further. He did not stop at love or lust. He began to teach. He showed humans how to make weapons, how to shape metal, how to mix roots and craft spells. He taught them how to adorn themselves, to manipulate beauty, to deceive. He introduced war, pride, vanity, and bloodshed. The other angels gave knowledge too, but Azazel's was different. His teachings were not just tools, they were temptations, and once given, they could never be taken back. The result was chaos. The earth groaned under the weight of sin and violence. The Nephilim turned on mankind, blood filled the land, and heaven, once silent, finally spoke. God sent angels to stop the rebellion, to chain the watchers beneath the earth, to wipe out the Nephilim in a flood. And Azazel was given a punishment more severe than the rest. He was bound in the desert under sharp rocks, covered in darkness, left there until the day of judgment. But his knowledge, the things he taught, those still remained. This is the part that makes the Vatican uncomfortable. Because if Azazel taught humanity some of its earliest skills, then not all knowledge came from divine permission. Some of it came from rebellion, from angels who disobeyed. That challenges the idea that all wisdom flows through holy channels. It suggests that what we know, how we build, how we fight, how we adorn ourselves, may have come from a pact that heaven tried to erase. The Church does not deny the story outright, but it never preaches it either. The Watchers are left in shadows. Azazel is called a myth or mistranslation, but the truth is written, and it has been for thousands of years. A group of angels made a pact. They descended, they taught, they fell, and the world has never been the same. Azazel was not just a fallen angel. He was the architect of a different kind of knowledge, a kind the Church never wanted people to know came from anyone other than God. And maybe that is why the book of Enoch was hidden. Because if the truth is that power came from rebellion, then what else has been born from forgotten pacts? And who still remembers them? Long before the word scapegoat existed, long before a goat was tied with a red cord and sent into the desert, there are signs that something much darker came first. The idea behind the ritual was simple. One being carries the sins of the community. That being is cast out or destroyed, and in doing so, the people are cleansed. But if you trace that idea back into the ancient world, past the Hebrew scriptures and past the temple rituals, you begin to uncover something unsettling. The earliest scapegoats may not have been goats at all. They may have been people. In ancient Mesopotamia, tablets speak of rituals where kings would symbolically transfer their guilt onto another person. A servant or a prisoner would be dressed in royal clothes, paraded through the city, and then executed or exiled. This person was called the substitute king. Once the ritual was complete, the real king would return to power, his danger removed. The idea was that misfortune, or divine anger, could be absorbed by a human figure and taken away. That person was chosen to carry the weight of sins they did not commit. A living scapegoat. In certain early cultures, children were sacrificed during times of drought or plague. They were seen as pure. The more innocent the victim, the more powerful the ritual. Their deaths were believed to cleanse the land, to remove the anger of the gods, to turn away disaster. In some parts of the ancient Near East, historical records suggest that entire villages would select an outsider, a stranger, someone with no family, and assign to them the burden of the community's failures. That person would then be killed, banished, or left in the wilderness. When the Hebrew ritual of the scapegoat was written down in Leviticus, it included something shocking for its time. The goat marked for Azazel was not killed. It was released into the wild, allowed to live, even if only for a little while. That was a turning point, because before that, the cleansing came through blood, through sacrifice. And while the goat became the official symbol, the idea that sins could be placed onto a body was much older, much more human. Even in early Christianity, echoes of this belief remained. Jesus was called the Lamb of God, a pure figure who carried the sins of the world and was sacrificed. The message was spiritual, but the structure followed an ancient pattern. One life exchanged for many, one body bearing the weight of guilt that belonged to others. What makes this history dangerous is not just that it happened, but that it shows how deeply the idea of human scapegoats is rooted in our past. The Vatican has never publicly acknowledged these earlier practices. To do so would mean admitting that the roots of sacred rituals might lie in blood rites that came before the Bible. It would mean recognizing that the desert offering to Azazel was a refinement of something older, something darker. The goat was never just an animal. It was a replacement, a substitute for what used to be human. And the rituals that shaped religions today may have once demanded far more than a creature led into the wilderness. They may have demanded a person, a life, a sacrifice the world was told to forget. During the Middle Ages, exorcism was not a dramatic display performed in front of crowds. It was a hidden ritual, carried out behind monastery walls or in small village chapels, usually in silence and secrecy. Priests trained in the art of casting out demons worked from hand-copied manuals, filled with ancient prayers, Latin invocations, and names that most people were never meant to hear. These names were believed to carry power, and among the lists of spirits and fallen beings, one name appeared so rarely, yet so clearly, that it raised questions no one wanted to answer. That name was Azazel. Unlike more common demons, whose identities were whispered through folklore and scripture, Azazel did not appear often in public sermons. But in certain private exorcism texts, passed between monasteries and stored in forbidden libraries, his name was written with care and caution. In one 13th century manuscript, known as the Munich Manual, a collection of exorcism and protection prayers, there is a passage that warns of a desert spirit who corrupts by teaching. It never directly says Azazel, but the clues are there. The mention of forbidden knowledge, of chains, of sand and stone. And in the margins, a later monk scribbled a single name in faded ink, Azazel. Another text, the Liber Veneficus, written in Latin around the 14th century and only found in fragments today, contains a detailed ritual of exorcism meant specifically for cases involving what it calls watchers. In one section, the instructions include a command to name the spirit to drive it out. Among the list of names, Azazel is included, not with the demons of lust or madness, but among those tied to pride, warfare, and rebellion. The tone is different, sharper, as if the priest feared speaking the name too loudly. Most priests avoided him altogether. To name Azazel was to admit that the Book of Enoch was real, that the Watchers had once walked the earth, that some knowledge was not from God, but from rebellion. The Vatican had already removed Enoch from the canon. Officially, the fallen angels were mythology. But these exorcists, deep in the trenches of spiritual warfare, did not always follow official doctrine. They wrote what they saw. And sometimes, what they saw was too old to be explained by the Church. In rare trial records from inquisitions, there are accounts of possessed individuals speaking of a being who taught them secrets in dreams, who appeared not with horns and fire, but in light, who offered knowledge, not torment. And in 2 cases, when pressed to name the spirit, the same answer was given: Azazel. The priests wrote it down, but never mentioned it again. These glimpses are all we have, faint echoes in forgotten books, but they suggest something that refuses to die, a name that keeps returning in the dark corners of spiritual battle. Not loud, not often, but enough to know that even centuries after his supposed fall, Azazel still moved in the places the Church could not reach, still whispered to those willing to listen, still remembered by those trained to cast him out. In the earliest Christian art, Satan did not have horns. He did not have hooves or a tail or the head of a goat. He was often shown as a shadowy figure or even as an angel twisted by pride. But something began to change around the 12th century. Slowly, Satan took on a different shape. His body became animalistic. His legs turned to hooves. His head grew horns. And eventually, he became the goat-like figure that most people recognize today. This was not just artistic style. It was symbolism. And behind that transformation lies a deeper story. A story that leads straight back to Azazel. The goat in ancient Hebrew culture was never just a farm animal. It carried meaning. It was chosen for sacrifice, chosen for cleansing, chosen to bear the sins of the people. In the Day of Atonement ritual, one goat was sent to God. The other was sent into the wilderness for Azazel. That goat was not evil, but it was burdened. It was marked. And over time, that image of the goat wandering into the desert became linked with something more sinister. A creature that carried guilt. A figure that took what others wanted to forget. As Christianity spread through Europe, it collided with local pagan traditions. Many of those older religions already had horned nature spirits. The Celtic god, Cernunnos, the Greek god Pan, wild goat-legged beings tied to forests, fertility, and chaos. The Church declared those gods to be demons, and as they tried to erase them, they also absorbed their images: the goat body, the twisted horns, the laughing face. Slowly, that became the new shape of evil. But what made the goat such a perfect symbol for Satan was its ancient connection to sacrifice and blame. In the eyes of the Church, Satan was not just a tempter. He was the one who bore the weight of sin, the one who was cast out, just like the scapegoat. And Azazel, the being the scapegoat was sent to, began to blend into that image. The Church never officially said Satan and Azazel were the same, but in art, in sermons, and in secret texts, the lines began to blur. By the time of the Inquisition, images of the devil almost always showed him in goat form. Horns curling up, hooves planted on rocky ground, eyes burning with knowledge. In witch trials, accused women were said to dance with the goat man in the woods, to kiss his hoof, to learn forbidden things. These stories echo the ancient fear that began with Azazel, the being who taught secrets, the being tied to the wilderness, the being the Church could never fully erase. So when you see the devil drawn as a goat, It is not just a symbol of evil. It is a memory, a reflection of rituals too old to forget. A creature born from sacrifice and sin, shaped by stories whispered in the dark. Azazel may have been buried in forgotten texts, but his image lived on, hidden in the horns, in the hooves, in the shadow of the goat that carried the sins of the world into the wilderness and never returned. In the ritual of the scapegoat, one of the strangest details is almost always overlooked. It is not the goat itself, or the wilderness, or even the mysterious figure of Azazel. It is the red cord. According to ancient writings, a crimson thread was tied around the horns of the goat, marked for Azazel. Another piece was tied around a rock at the edge of the cliff, where the goat would be pushed. It was more than decoration. It was a sign, a symbol that something had been transferred, a signal that this animal was no longer just a goat. It was carrying something invisible, the weight of a nation's guilt. The Talmud, a collection of ancient Jewish writings, tells an even stranger story. It says that in the early days of the ritual, after the goat was sent into the wilderness, the red thread on the temple door would turn white. The people took this as a sign that their sins had been forgiven, that the offering had worked, that heaven had accepted the transfer. But in the final years before the temple was destroyed, something changed. The thread stopped turning white. The ritual was the same. The goat still walked into the desert, but the sign never came. That shift sent waves of fear through the priesthood. It was as if the unseen world had gone silent. What is strange is that echoes of the red cord show up again in early Christian symbols. In some medieval Catholic rituals, scarlet threads were used in processions to mark the path of purification. In certain monasteries, red ribbons were tied to crosses during Lent, symbolizing the blood of Christ and the sins he carried. The Church never claimed these were linked to the scapegoat, but the pattern is there, a red line representing guilt, a thread that leads from the people to a sacrifice. Even more mysterious is how the color red was treated in older Catholic exorcisms. Some texts describe using a red sash to bind a possessed person. Others speak of red cords placed on doorways to keep spirits from entering. The symbolism had shifted. It was no longer about goats or deserts. It was about protection, cleansing. But the idea remained the same. The color red marked the boundary between sin and forgiveness, between what was pure and what had been touched by something else. Some believe the red cord was never just a symbol, that it held ritual power, that the act of tying it, of marking the scapegoat, of watching the thread change color, was part of a much older magic, one that even the priests did not fully understand. If Azazel was truly receiving the goat, then the cord was the final connection, a physical tether between the world of men and the world of forgotten beings. Today, the red thread has vanished from most rituals. It is remembered only in fragments, in commentaries, in scattered traditions. But for those who study the deeper meanings of these ancient acts, the red cord remains one of the most mysterious clues, a scarlet signpost pointing back to a moment when sin could be passed like a torch, when guilt had color, and when the world still believed that a simple thread could tie heaven to earth and hold back whatever waited in the wild. For generations, the Day of Atonement was the most sacred day in the Hebrew calendar. It was the one day when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, the one day when the sins of the people were placed on a goat and sent into the wilderness. The ritual was strict. Every step mattered. One goat was sacrificed to God, The other was led away, bearing the sins of the nation, marked with a red cord tied around its horns. Another piece of the cord was fastened to the temple gate. The people would gather in silence, waiting for the final sign. When the ritual worked, the cord would turn white. It was not a trick or a legend. It was recorded, witnessed, celebrated, a miracle repeated year after year. But then, something changed. According to the Talmud, specifically in the book of Yoma, about 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the red cord stopped turning white. The goat still went into the wilderness, the prayers were still recited, the sacrifice was still offered, but the miracle never came. The red thread remained red. The sign of forgiveness did not appear. And for those watching, it was terrifying. Because without the thread changing, how could they know their sins had truly been removed? The number 40 is not random. That time period lines up with the death of Jesus of Nazareth, believed by Christians to be the ultimate atonement. Some early Christian thinkers later claimed that the reason the cord stopped turning white was because the final sacrifice had already been made. That the ritual no longer worked because it was no longer needed. But to the priests inside the temple, this explanation was not available. All they saw was a ritual that had always worked suddenly failing, and they did not know why. The silence that followed this moment was heavy. The high priest would still carry out the ritual each year, but now with uncertainty. Some believed God had turned away. Others whispered that something had gone wrong in the spirit world, that the offering was no longer reaching its destination, that Azazel had refused the goat, or worse, that the sins could no longer be placed on anything outside themselves. Imagine standing at the temple gate, watching the red cord flutter in the wind, waiting, hoping, knowing that last year it stayed red, that the year before it stayed red, and that this year would likely be no different. What began as a moment of divine confirmation had turned into a sign of absence. An absence in a ritual built on presence was unbearable. By the year 70, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans. The scapegoat ritual ended. The red cord disappeared from history, but the memory of it stayed. A sign that once meant forgiveness now carried the weight of unanswered questions. The thread did not break, it just stopped changing. And maybe that was worse, because it meant the ritual had become hollow. The goat still walked into the wilderness, but nothing left with it. The sins remained. The silence deepened. And the people were left to wonder if Azazel had gone quiet, or if he was watching, and simply no longer willing to take the blame. When Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire, it brought with it a message of forgiveness, redemption, and sacrifice. But underneath that message was a much older pattern, a structure that had existed long before the cross. The idea that one life could carry the weight of many, that sin could be transferred, that suffering could be placed on a substitute. In the heart of Christian theology, that structure took new form. It became the Passion of Christ, a ritual of substitution that mirrored the ancient scapegoat, but now placed on a man instead of a goat. Jesus of Nazareth was called many things: Messiah, Teacher, Son of God. But one title stood out in the writings of early Christians: the Lamb, the sacrificial Lamb, the one who would bear the sins of the world. It was a direct echo of the Day of Atonement, the high priest, the offering, the transfer of guilt. But now, instead of a temple ceremony, it happened on a cross. Instead of a red cord, there was a crown of thorns. Instead of the wilderness, there was a hill outside the city, Golgotha. The Gospel writers made the connection clear. They said Jesus was led like a lamb to the slaughter, that he carried the burden of humanity's sin, that his death was not just a tragedy, but a fulfillment, a ritual long prepared. In this view, Jesus became both goats at once, the one sacrificed to God and the one sent away into the realm of darkness, a divine substitution wrapped in blood and mystery. This reinterpretation allowed the Church to absorb the power of the older ritual while transforming it into something new. The temple was no longer needed. The scapegoat was no longer an animal. The wilderness was no longer a desert, but the silence of death itself. And the red cord became the blood that stained the wood of the cross. The Church taught that because of this act, the need for all other sacrifices had ended, that sin could now be forgiven through faith in Christ. No more altars, no more goats, just one perfect offering for all time. But even as the Church moved forward with this new understanding, traces of the old ritual remained. In some Catholic masses, the priest still speaks of Christ as the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. In certain Holy Week processions, a figure of Jesus is paraded through the streets, beaten, mocked, and carried to a symbolic death. The people watch, some cry, some cheer. And the ancient structure appears once more. One body, many sins, a crowd that watches as blame is carried away. What Christianity did was not erase the scapegoat. It redefined it. It gave it a face, a voice, and a purpose beyond ritual. But the roots were always there. From the wilderness to the cross, the path was marked by substitution. And the Church, knowingly or not, followed that path all the way back to the desert, where a goat once walked into the unknown, carrying the weight of a people who could not carry it themselves. During the long and terrifying centuries of European witch hunts, thousands of people were accused, tortured, and killed for crimes that were often vague and impossible to prove. Many of the accusations came from fear, from superstition, from power struggles. But beneath the surface, hidden in the language of the trials and the images drawn in the margins of dusty manuals, there were echoes of something much older, something tied to a desert spirit that the Church tried to forget. The name Azazel may not have been spoken aloud in the courts, but his shadow was everywhere. In many witch trial documents from the 15th to the 17th century, women and sometimes men were accused of gathering at secret meetings in the wilderness. These meetings were called Sabbaths. The location was almost always remote. A forest clearing, a mountain slope, a place where the trees whispered and no church bells could be heard. There, according to the accusations, witches danced around a horned figure, a man with the legs of a goat, cloven hooves, a face half human, half beast, and eyes that promised forbidden knowledge. This creature was often called the devil, but his description matched something else. He was said to teach spells, to offer power, to reveal secrets of herbs, stars, and transformation. These were the same gifts Azazel gave in the Book of Enoch: weapons, charms, makeup, sorcery, knowledge that was once divine but had become forbidden. The connection was never written in ink by the inquisitors, but it lived in the stories. The goat, the wildness, the desert spirit now reborn in the forests of Europe. Some witch trial confessions, often forced under torture, included the claim that the witches had to kiss the goat man, that they pledged themselves to him, that he marked them. These marks were searched for on the body, and any strange mole or scar could be taken as proof. But the idea of the mark also echoes another old symbol, the red cord tied to the scapegoat, a sign that someone had become a carrier of sin, that they had been chosen to hold what others feared. In this twisted logic, the witch became the scapegoat. She was blamed for the sickness of the land, the failure of crops, the death of children. She carried the guilt of the community. And just like the goat in the ancient ritual, she was cast out, shunned, destroyed. Her death was meant to cleanse, to restore order, but it only fed the fear, because the wilderness was not emptied. The horned figure still appeared in dreams. The old knowledge still flickered in secret. What the church feared was not just the witch, it was the memory she carried, of a time when power came from a different source, of a being who once taught the world things that could not be unlearned. Azazel had been buried in forgotten books, but his story survived in whispers, in shapes drawn in ash, in the terrified words of people who said they saw the goat man in the woods, and who never knew that what they saw was not just the devil, but something far more ancient, a spirit with no temple, no name, only a promise and a price. In the year 1307, on a quiet Friday morning, soldiers moved through the streets of France with sealed orders. They carried out arrests across the country, all targeting a single group, the Knights Templar. These warrior monks had once been the most powerful military order in Christendom, trusted by kings and feared by enemies. But now they were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and the unthinkable. Among the charges whispered through the courts and carved into the records of their trials was one that stood out above the rest, that the Templars worshipped an idol with the head of a goat. The name of this idol was said to be Baphomet. The descriptions varied. Some said it was a human skull. Others said it had 3 faces. But over time, the image sharpened. A statue with wings, a human body, the head of a goat, horns rising like flames. It was said the Templars bowed before it, kissed it, spoke secrets to it, even asked it for wisdom. The church was horrified, not just because of what the idol looked like, but because of what it reminded them of. An ancient figure buried in texts most priests were not allowed to read. Azazel. No trial documents directly say the Templars worshipped Azazel, but the imagery lines up too closely to ignore. The goat-headed figure, the wilderness rites, the idea of hidden knowledge given in exchange for loyalty. These were all traits of the desert spirit named in the Book of Enoch. The one cast out for revealing forbidden truths, the one linked to the scapegoat and the wilderness, the one the church erased from the Bible but could never fully erase from memory. Some believe the Templars did not invent this figure but recovered it. During the Crusades, they had access to ancient texts and relics stored in Eastern libraries and mosques. They moved through lands where the old gods were still whispered about. They guarded ruins, searched caves, and may have found writings that included Azazel's name. If they saw him not as a demon, but as a fallen teacher, a being who gave power and insight, they may have revered him in secret. Not as a god, but as a keeper of forgotten knowledge. The church could not allow that. To admit that the Templars had found something true in the ruins of the ancient world would be to admit that Scripture was incomplete, that there were paths of wisdom outside Rome. So the Templars were destroyed, their leaders tortured, their order dissolved. But the image of the goat-headed figure did not disappear. It became darker, twisted, rebranded as Baphomet. a name that could be safely feared without asking where it came from. But in the old symbols, in the carved lines and secret signs, the shape remains the same. A figure once tied to the scapegoat, once blamed for teaching too much. The Templars may have called him by another name, but the story points to the same being. Azazel, not forgotten, not gone, just hidden, waiting beneath layers of fear and fire. A secret the Church could not destroy, only bury. In the halls of the oldest Catholic universities, behind thick stone walls and locked wooden doors, there were rooms where only certain priests were allowed to enter. These rooms were not for prayer or confession. They were for study. Dangerous study. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as the Jesuit order rose to power within the Church, a few of its brightest minds were given access to something most Catholics were never meant to see. Ancient texts, lost manuscripts, books that the Vatican had hidden away. And in those pages, they found a name, Azazel. The Jesuits weren't ordinary priests. They were scholars, scientists, and missionaries, trained in logic, language, and scripture. They were sent across the world to spread the faith, but also to gather knowledge. In places like Rome, Salamanca, and Prague, Jesuit libraries held volumes older than the Church itself, some written in Aramaic, others in Greek, Hebrew, or languages no one could fully translate. In the margins of these texts, the same figure kept appearing, a being tied to the wilderness, to rebellion, to forbidden teachings. His name had been scraped from some pages, blurred in others, but the careful reader could still find it, Azazel. At least 3 Jesuit scholars are known to have studied these texts in the early 17th century. Father Matteo Vasari of Florence, Father Jakob Edelheim of Vienna, and Father Luis Corral of Toledo. Each had a reputation for deep knowledge of angelology and exorcism. Each wrote private letters to Rome requesting permission to continue their work on what they called prelapsarian entities. In one surviving letter from Vasari, he describes Azazel not as a demon, but as a gatekeeper, a being punished not for evil, but for revealing divine structures too soon. Shortly after sending this letter, Father Vasari vanished from Jesuit records. There is no mention of death, no assignment, just a blank space. The same happens with Edelheim and Corral. Their letters stop, their assignments are cancelled, their names are removed from teaching rosters and internal logs. It is as if they were quietly erased. Some historians say they were silenced, that the Vatican intervened to stop their research before it became public. Others believe they uncovered something that frightened even them, that Azazel was not just a figure of the past, but something present, active, watching those who tried to understand him. A few whispers inside old seminaries claim these Jesuits kept journals that were confiscated and locked in the Vatican's secret archive. If true, those pages could hold the Church's most hidden fears. Today, no official Jesuit teachings mention Azazel. His name does not appear in catechisms or classroom lectures. But in the oldest corners of certain Jesuit libraries, pages still sit untouched. Books that smell of dust and ink. Notes scribbled in Latin about desert spirits and ancient covenants. And the silence surrounding those 3 names remains loud. The Jesuits who studied Azazel tried to follow the truth wherever it led. But they may have stepped into something older than doctrine, something the Church had buried for a reason. And once they crossed that line, they were never seen again. Not by their students, not by their order, not by history. Only the name Azazel remained, written in ink that never quite fades. Every Sunday, Inside churches across the world, millions of people speak the same words. They beat their chests with closed fists. They bow their heads. And they say in Latin, or in translation, through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. It is called the Confitia, a prayer of confession and purification that opens the Catholic Mass. To most people, it feels like simple repentance, a way to clear the soul before approaching the altar. But hidden inside this ritual is something much older, a pattern that matches the ancient scapegoat ceremony more closely than most would ever guess. In the temple ritual of Yom Kippur, the high priest would place both hands on the head of a goat and confess the sins of the people out loud. The idea was clear. The guilt left the priest and entered the animal, a spiritual transfer. Then the goat, now bearing the weight of that sin, was sent into the wilderness. The people watched it go and believed their sins had been carried away. In the Catholic Confiteor, there is no goat, no wilderness. But the movement is the same. The sin is named. It is spoken. It is handed off. In deeper layers of Catholic tradition, there is another act called the rite of reconciliation, confession. The priest sits in place of Christ and listens to the sins of the penitent. At the end, absolution is granted, the burden lifted. But it does not simply vanish. In theological terms, that guilt is transferred to Christ, to the one who already bore the sin of the world, just like the scapegoat, a figure who takes on guilt and is sent away. On Ash Wednesday, believers are marked with a cross of black ash on their foreheads. The priest says, "Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return." This act echoes the red cord tied to the scapegoat, a visible sign placed on the body to mark guilt and to remind the person that death is the price of sin. But unlike the scapegoat, who carried the guilt into the wild, the modern ritual draws it inward. The ash does not go away. It stays on the skin. Even during Good Friday, the Church reenacts the Passion of Christ in a way that mirrors the old pattern. A single figure suffers. The people look on. There is silence. A ritual substitution plays out on altars all over the world. And though the words are different, the structure remains the same. One life, many sins. A transfer that must take place to keep the system working. Most Catholics do not realize the connection. They are taught only the surface. That these acts are symbols. That the prayers are simply ancient poetry. But deep in the bones of the Church, the ritual of substitution still breathes. The scapegoat has changed its shape. It is no longer an animal pushed into the desert. It is now a man on a cross. A prayer whispered in darkness, a mark on the forehead. But the function is the same. Sin does not disappear. It must go somewhere. And even now, 2,000 years later, the Church still performs the ancient act. A quiet handoff of guilt. A transfer older than Rome, older than the Church, and maybe even older than the Bible itself. In the dry caves near the Dead Sea, a shepherd searching for a lost goat threw a stone into the dark and heard pottery break. That moment in 1947 led to one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Over 900 ancient manuscripts hidden in jars, buried in silence for almost 2,000 years. Most of the world focused on what these scrolls revealed about the Bible, early versions of Genesis, Psalms, and Isaiah. But buried deep within the lesser-known texts was a name that shocked scholars, a name the Church had long avoided: Azazel. Among the scrolls found in Cave 4 was a strange text known as the Apocalypse of Abraham. In this scroll, Azazel is not just mentioned. he is described as a force of darkness, a spirit of chaos who dwells in the wilderness. He is tied to sin, corruption, and human weakness. But what makes this scroll different is that Azazel is not treated as a metaphor. He is a character, real, active, speaking, and perhaps most importantly, separate from Satan. In most modern theology, all evil is lumped under the figure of the devil. But in these older writings, the enemy is more complex. Azazel appears as one of the Watchers, the rebellious angels mentioned in the Book of Enoch. He is called the Master of the Wasteland, the one who leads souls astray by teaching forbidden knowledge. He is linked directly to idol worship and blood sacrifice. And in one passage, he is condemned not just for corrupting humans, but for teaching them how to make war. The scroll describes a future moment where Azazel will be judged, where he will fall into the abyss he once ruled. But until then, he roams the earth, influencing the minds of the powerful, hiding behind systems and rituals, always just beyond reach. This image of Azazel is far more detailed than anything found in the Bible, and that has caused problems. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first translated and published, not all texts were treated equally. Scholars focused on those that lined up with existing scripture. Fragments that confirmed the Old Testament were highlighted, but the darker scrolls, the ones that spoke of fallen angels, desert spirits, and ancient rituals, were pushed aside. Azazel's name was not featured in press releases. His role was not included in Sunday school lessons. Even today, most people do not know that the Dead Sea Scrolls speak of him at all. His presence is overshadowed by more familiar names. But for those who read carefully, his fingerprints are everywhere. In curses, in visions, in prayers that plead for protection from forces unnamed. The scrolls remind us that ancient people feared Azazel for a reason. They did not see him as myth. They saw him as real, powerful, and still active in the world. And perhaps that is why his name was buried again. Not by time, but by choice. Because even now, some names are too dangerous to speak. And Azazel remains one of them, hidden in the caves, written in faded ink, waiting. Across the deserts of the ancient Near East, where the winds speak through jagged rocks and shadows move without warning, stories began to form. Stories of a creature not fully human and not fully beast. A figure with the legs of a goat, the chest of a man, and horns rising from its head like twisted branches. It appeared in dreams and in heat-struck visions, always on the edge of sight. Some called it a spirit, others called it a demon. But over time, the figure became something more, a symbol of exile, of knowledge lost, of judgment roaming free. This was the creature in the wilderness. The Hebrew word used in some of the oldest biblical texts is seirim, which means hairy ones or goat demons. These beings were believed to live in desolate places far from human settlements. The book of Isaiah even warns that jackals will cry to one another and goat demons shall dance there, speaking of ruined lands where no man dares to stay. These were not simple animals. They were hybrids, figures of wildness and temptation. And although their names changed over centuries, the image stayed the same. In ancient Mesopotamia, tablets speak of beings that haunted the edge of civilization. One called the Udughul was described as walking upright with hooves and burning eyes. In Egypt, desert gods like Set carried the head of a beast and ruled over chaos. In Canaanite mythology, there were whispers of watchers and spirits cast down from the heavens who took on twisted shapes and wandered the wastelands. All of them carried traits that mirrored each other. And all of them seemed to be echoes of the same forbidden figure. As time moved forward, these creatures faded from public belief, but not from private fear. Medieval desert travelers told of encountering strange tracks in the sand, tracks that began as human footprints and ended as hoofprints. Monks writing in the silence of desert monasteries described feeling watched at night by something they could not see, something that felt ancient and patient. In more recent times, explorers in regions like Sinai and the Negev have come across rock carvings showing horned figures with bent legs and human torsos. These were not decorative, they were warnings, signs carved into stone that the edge of the world was near, that beyond this point lived something old, something that had once been known but was now unnamed. What makes all of this so strange is how the image keeps returning. In folktales, in nightmares, in forgotten drawings, the goatman, the watcher, the exile. Some believe it is a memory of Azazel, passed down through fear rather than scripture. A being who was never destroyed, only pushed out. A creature cast into the wilderness, left to wander the places men avoid. And maybe the wilderness itself remembers. The dry winds, the broken hills, the silence between footsteps. Maybe they all carry the whisper of a presence still walking under the sun, still watching, still waiting. The creature in the wilderness is not just a myth. It is a reminder that what is cast out does not always die. Sometimes it changes shape. Sometimes it becomes the thing you only see when you stop looking. If Azazel is just a symbol, then he is no threat, just a name from a forgotten ritual, a shadow cast by fear. But if Azazel is real, everything changes. If he was once a living being with purpose, action, and intent, then the foundations of modern theology begin to crack. The Church has spent centuries building a structure where good and evil are cleanly divided, where God rules the heavens and Satan rules the underworld, where all sin traces back to a single fall. But Azazel doesn't fit that system. He is not Satan. He is not a serpent in a garden. He is something else entirely, and that makes him dangerous. In the Book of Enoch, Azazel is blamed for teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity. Weapons, magic, beauty, power. These are not the tools of chaos. These are the tools of civilization. If Azazel gave these things to humans, then he played a role in shaping the world. Not as a destroyer, but as a guide. A corrupter, maybe, but also a teacher. That alone is enough to cause panic in theological circles, because it introduces the idea that humanity's development did not come from divine order alone, but from a rebel spirit. A being outside of heaven who gave gifts the heavens never approved. This shakes the idea of holy exclusivity, that truth only flows from God through chosen prophets. If Azazel gave truth, then truth exists outside the Church. That threatens everything. It blurs the lines. It suggests that what was once called heresy might actually be history. The red cord, the scapegoat, the wilderness. These were not just pieces of ritual. They were mechanisms for spiritual transfer. The idea that sin can be placed on something else, that guilt can be carried away. This is the same idea the Church reformed through Christ. A final sacrifice, a substitution that ended all need for scapegoats. But if Azazel still exists, still roams, still receives, then the system is not closed, the door is not locked. There is still a receiver in the wilderness, a being who plays a role in the spiritual economy of the world. And if that is true, then the Church does not control the full map. There are players on the board it cannot explain. The Vatican has avoided this conversation for a long time. The Book of Enoch is not in the canon. The scapegoat ritual is dismissed as symbolic. The wilderness is reduced to metaphor. Azazel is painted over, translated out, replaced with vagueness. But his shadow remains. In old texts, in forgotten rites, in strange gaps where answers should be. Azazel reminds us that not everything was filtered through Rome, that some powers were never conquered, only ignored, and that truth, once given, cannot be taken back. It lingers. It survives. Even when hidden, even when buried beneath centuries of silence, the Vatican needs Azazel forgotten, because remembering him means admitting there was once another voice, one that taught, one that challenged, one that still waits beyond the walls. The scapegoat ritual may have vanished from temples and deserts, but its pattern never left. It simply changed clothes. It slipped into culture, into politics, into the way we treat each other without even realizing it. Today, we live in a world that claims to be rational and advanced. We say we no longer believe in magic, in desert spirits, in rituals with goats. But the truth is, we still act out the same script. The ancient mechanism has returned, not through ceremony, but through behavior. And most people do not even notice. At the heart of scapegoating is one simple idea. When a group feels fear, guilt, or shame, it looks for someone to blame. That blame must go somewhere. It cannot stay in the center. It must be pushed outward, onto a person, onto a symbol, onto someone who looks different, thinks different, or simply happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That person is then treated as if they carry all the wrongness of the group, all the sin, all the tension, all the things no one wants to admit. And when that person is attacked, silenced, or removed, the group feels peace. For a moment. This is not just theory. It happens every day. On social media, people are singled out and torn apart for things they said years ago. In politics, entire communities are blamed for the problems of an economy. In schools, one student becomes the target of all frustration. In families, one child is labeled the problem. In companies, one worker is blamed for decisions made by many. The faces change, but the mechanism stays the same. French thinker René Girard studied this pattern and called it the scapegoat mechanism. He said it was older than religion, deeper than law. It is how societies maintain order when they do not know how to handle conflict. And most of the time, the scapegoat does not deserve the blame. But that is not the point. The point is that the group needs to feel clean. Just like in the ancient ritual, the scapegoat carries the guilt of others. What makes this even more disturbing is that the mechanism works. For a while, the group feels better. The blame is gone. The anxiety fades. But only until the next crisis. Then the cycle begins again. A new scapegoat is found, a new sacrifice is made, and the machine turns once more. In this way, Azazel has never left us. He was not just a figure in the wilderness, he was the structure behind how humans survive their own guilt. The ritual was always about more than goats. It was about projection, about transfer, about making someone else hold what we cannot face. Modern society still plays out the scapegoat drama, just with different props. Screens instead of altars, hashtags instead of red cords. But the outcome is the same. Someone is pushed out so the rest can feel pure. And the question remains, how long can we keep doing this before we realize that the wilderness is not empty, that what we throw away always circles back, and that maybe the thing we fear most is not the scapegoat, but the reason we need one. He was cast out into the wilderness. That is what the old texts say. Not killed, not destroyed, just sent away, bearing the weight of a people's guilt, walking into the silence of the desert. Azazel was not erased, he was exiled. And that difference changes everything, because when something is killed, it ends. But when something is exiled, it waits. For thousands of years, his name has moved through forbidden scrolls, whispered prayers, and cracked stone altars. It shows up in the shadows of forgotten rituals, in the margins of sacred books, in the curses that no one wants to say out loud. But it always appears, just enough to prove he was never fully gone. And that is what terrifies the Vatican. The Church can handle symbols. It can explain away demons. It can reinterpret ancient stories into metaphors. But it cannot handle a question that refuses to disappear. A question that stands at the edge of doctrine like a ghost at the end of a hallway. What if Azazel is still here, not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as a presence? The scapegoat ritual was meant to remove sin, to send it far away. But where is far enough? Where does guilt actually go when you send it into the wild? Does it vanish into the sand, or does it gather in one place, in one figure, waiting, watching, becoming something more, something heavier, something that knows the names of those who cast it out? The Vatican has gone silent on Azazel. They do not include him in catechism. His name does not echo in the Mass. His story is not told from the pulpit. And yet, they still preserve the rituals. They still perform the transfers. They still use symbols that match the old ones, as if the system still needs him, but cannot admit it. The ancient texts say he taught secrets, that he gave humanity gifts too powerful to be held, that he showed them how to become more than they were, and for that, he was punished, banished, made into the carrier of blame for all that came after. But the punishment never said how long. It never said what would happen if he returned. In a world more connected than ever, where old knowledge is being rediscovered, where lost books are being translated, where rituals are being revived by people who do not even know why, the question grows louder. If Azazel was sent away, then where did he go? If he was cast into the wilderness, then what did he become? The Vatican fears this question not because it doubts its own power, but because it knows the truth it cannot control is the most dangerous kind. If Azazel is still out there, still bearing the weight of human guilt, then the ritual is not over. The transfer is still active, and the wilderness is no longer empty. So now the question waits. At the edge of faith, at the edge of memory, at the edge of silence. Where is Azazel now?